UK corruption. The time limit is 1 hour. Baroness Jones and Molescombe.
Thank you very much for coming today. It has been incredibly difficult for me to finalise what I'm going to say this afternoon, simply because I wanted to mention a current fiasco, a current example of corruption, and there were so many popping up, I had to keep delaying what I was putting into my speech. However, I decided to go with the issue of quasi-Kwarteng, because I thought that was a rather nice one. But anyway, the point for me is that political corruption is absolutely endemic in our country, and we really ought to be ashamed of that. It's a case that it's embedded in our system, and we often fail to recognise it simply because we don't know about it, because it's covered up. And it does a huge amount of damage. It damages our social fabric, it damages individuals, I would argue, who engage in it, and it's not all about personal greed, it's sometimes about corporate greed, but it is about greed, and it contributes to the growing gap between rich and poor. And of course it also stops us dealing with major issues like poverty, but also our climate emergency. So today in 10 minutes I do not have enough time to deal with all the forms of corruption you can imagine. I can't deal with, for example, corruption in the police, in prisons, local government, associated with our borders, within the construction sector, or even amongst Lords' appointments, which of course would be a very rich source of stories about corruption. So I'm going to deal with 4 types of corruption, and there is some overlap. I'm going to deal with political access, corporate lobbying, party donations, and procurement and privatisation. Now, first and foremost and most obvious is political access. And our Chancellor, in his previous job, held undisclosed meetings with the chief executive of I could list them all: Saudi Aramco, the world's largest oil producer, the chief executive of SABIC, the world's 4th largest petrochemical company, and the chair of Alphanar Group, an industrial conglomerate. Now, obviously, meeting these people is absolutely fine. That could be easily part of his job, but they are meant to be logged by civil servants. And a government spokesperson said there'd been an administrative oversight. And it leads to the question, how many administrative oversights of the kind never come to light? Now, Kwarteng was flown around the kingdom by various helicopters and jets, and it apparently provided the opportunity for the oil company to lobby the minister, then responsible for the UK's energy policy, lobby him on opportunities for the company. And of course, other points of discussion on the flight were redacted, so we actually don't know what they talked about. And although it's perfectly okay to take lifts, he really should not have taken lifts from private companies. And then we have people like Owen Paterson working for Randox as a second job, and David Cameron using his inside track to lobby for Grenfell. Money buys access. And, for example, the personal phone numbers of civil servants, ministers, officials. A recent Parliamentary Accounts Committee report said that it could not be sure all the Randox contracts were worth 777 million were, a quote, awarded properly with obvious potential for conflicts of interest. And on Grenfell, the Treasury Committee accepted that Mr Cameron didn't break the rules governing lobbying by former ministers, but stated that this reflects on the insufficient strength of the rules. So we can't hold people to account. And the public's view becomes that there's one rule for people like us and another for them. And of course, it's not only things like Partygate, which showed a clear division about what people were allowed to do. It's also clear from the way the government tried to change the rules to get Owen Paterson off the hook. This is systemic corruption. And it's not isolated individual corruption. We should all be very concerned. These examples are the tip of the iceberg, the individual cases that we get to hear about because of media activity. My second issue is corporate lobbying and its influence over policy. Now, Uber spent £75 million a year on public relations and lobbying to successfully swing policies in its favour. Companies only spend that kind of money because they think it will guarantee them a profitable return. Many second jobs that MPs have are actually a form of corporate lobbying, a value for money addition to the company's PR budget that buys them the access they need. For example, Nadeem Zahawi allegedly earned $1.3 million from his second job at Gulf Keystone Petroleum. Now again, this isn't illegal, he can do that, but it is a much bigger and damaging influence on our politics and policies than parliamentarians want to admit. As well as individual companies lobbying, there's a network of right-wing think tanks that refuse to declare their corporate donors, but launch policy reports on issues that directly benefit those donors. The media should be demanding transparency, but so should Parliament when we see those policy institutes give us opinions disguised as evidence, and sometimes their members are even promoted to jobs in government. To quote George Monbiot in 2011, Downing Street and government in the last decade has been completely captured by this network. He's referring to the right-wing think tanks. And the third form of corruption, party donations, is more direct and visible because big donations to political parties have to be declared. And we can strongly suspect that the reason why we are still building houses and new developments without solar panels, without the best energy conservation standards available, or without charging points or heat pumps is because property tycoons account for around a fifth of donations to the Conservative Party. The reason that people are buying new homes and they are energy bill payers rather than net contributors to the grid is because developers paid a toll of nearly £891,000 to the Conservative Party in just the first quarter of 2021 alone. So the reason we're struggling to get a common sense measure like charging points for electric vehicles as standard on new buildings is because developers don't like it, and they pay good money to ensure the Conservative Party listens to them more than it listens to climate scientists. And isn't it strange that oil and gas companies are getting more licences, new licences in the North Sea, despite the climate emergency? Or why oil and gas companies are getting £150 billion of taxpayers' money, which they haven't done anything extra to earn? Or why taxpayers are carrying the burden of that £150 billion for the next 20 years instead of a windfall tax? Systemic political corruption has real-world consequences and real victims. So it's important to put this on the record now so that the next generation can understand how Parliament did relatively little while the world started to heat up and burn in our climate emergency. The fourth category of corruption, and perhaps the largest in terms of profitability, is the British system of procurement and privatisation. It's become a visible form of corruption due to the excesses of the COVID crisis. The system for preventing conflicts of interest failed, with firms referred to the government's VIP lane, a dedicated mailbox for parliamentarians and officials, 10 times more likely to win contracts. 25 of the 50 companies in this VIP lane supplied PPE worth £1 billion that wasn't fit for purpose, amounting to 59% of all money awarded to VIP lane companies for PPE. So the COVID purchasing fast track was open to abuse, and that's what the government encouraged in the middle of a pandemic. This is the reason why the government is now burning £4 billion of PPE unusable kit supplied by donors and friends of the regime, bought with taxpayers' money. And this corruption was hidden behind a wall of lawyers who worked on behalf of the government to hide the most basic information about who benefited from the contracts and who they spoke to in order to get the contract. This is collusional corruption and points to systemic corruption. And of course, we're not immune here in your Lordship's house. In June, it emerged that one Conservative peer accepted £3,000 a month from a private firm to open doors with Number 10 and ministers. Now, I like open doors. I nudge a few doors open myself to help people, but I don't take money for it. I do it for the people who can't afford to pay for it. And I make sure that they do get their voices heard. It's not a democracy if you have to pay for access. It's more like a Putin-style oligarchy run for and by the rich and the corporations. So I think I'm running out of time, which is absolutely infuriating because I've got another 2 or 3 pages. And of course, I could have spent all day here listing the problems and listing the corruptions. We need this government gone. And I'm not so naive to think that will be the solution to everything, because of course it won't. What we need is decent rules, strong rules, and people to understand that they are going to get caught.
My Lords, I